Welcome to the Cannabis Sativa L portion of this training. Cannabis Sativa L is otherwise known as marijuana, and we're going to go over all the slang terms for marijuana or cannabis, and there's a lot of them. So we'll see how long I can stay around in your presence. Some of the slides I might have to just disappear, and we'll have to go through them so you can actually see what's on it, and you'll still hear me, but I like to be visible as much as I can so that this isn't just a bunch of PowerPoints with some narration behind it, because I don't particularly care for that either. So let us get started, and I'll see how long I can stick around. All right, let's go. So we have the good old-fashioned marijuana leaf, some cannabis oil, hash oil, whatever you want to call it. It's pretty much the same thing. And just to let you know, most photos, like 98% of the photos I show you, are all my own photos. The hash oil here is not my photo, and the reason it's not my photo is I've never seen hash oil. I've seen hash. This is actually a chunk of hash right here that was recovered in Phoenix. And this, I like to tell a little story behind it, because when I was a school resource officer, I actually had a student that brought that marijuana leaf to school. And as we know, or in case you didn't know, THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, it's prevalent, it's in the leaves, but that's not what you smoke, is the leaves. You smoke the flowering portion of the plant, known as the bud, right? That's where the slang term bud comes from. Bud, like a flowering bud. Well, this young student brought this marijuana leaf to school, showing it off to all the other kids, and I caught wind of it, and so we brought him into the office, and sure enough, he had a marijuana leaf, and he thought, hey, what's the big deal about a marijuana leaf? It's not marijuana. It's not like the bud. And he didn't know that there's actually THC, or an active ingredient, in marijuana leaves. And so obviously he got charged with it. We took his leaf, and it was actually a really nice leaf. I can see why he brought it to school and was showing it off. So I took a really nice photo, and that's actually a photograph of it. And yeah, it was quite a day. So I show you that marijuana leaf because it goes into the next story here, which is this hash. This is hash. It's the only hash I've ever seen. And it's somewhat rare in Phoenix, or it was at the time. Marijuana oil or hash oil is becoming more popular now, but hash is used by certain ethnic groups, predominantly like in the Middle East, and so it's not real popular. Well, it turns out that there was a gentleman in the Sunny Slope area of Phoenix that was making hash, and one day somebody got upset with him, and he ended up getting killed. Like, he opened the front door, somebody shot him, he fell right inside the door, he died, and suspects got away. And as far as I know, the suspects were never apprehended. Well, it turns out so the homicide detectives got called out because of a homicide. They started going through the residence, and they started finding all these chemicals in the house, like glass beakers, just like that glass beaker right here, jars of chemicals, and they thought they had a meth lab. So they called our unit out. I was working meth labs at the time. We came out, got all suited up, went in the house, started looking at all this glassware, and we're looking at it, kind of scratching our heads, because it wasn't consistent with chemicals that are used to make methamphetamine. There was some a solvent. There was, I want to say it was acetone. I believe it was acetone that was in this house. So acetone is used in making methamphetamine, as we'll find out later. But acetone had this brown liquid and substance in it, not that jar. So I guess I have seen some jars with some brown liquid in it, but I didn't get photos of it. Now maybe I have some somewhere. I'll have to look. But what we did find is the hash there on the bottom of the screen. So it turns out, neighbors said, oh yeah, this guy, like, people would bring over big old trash bags, like leaf bags, like, when you rake leaves and you fill it up, big old bags, and they were bringing them in the house, and that would happen now and then. at least they would notice it. And they thought it was really suspicious, but they never really put two and two together. Usually trash goes out of a house. Usually trash bags don't go into a house. So that would be a clue if you ever see something like that. Maybe there's something going on, and maybe not investigate too deep, because you don't want to get yourself involved in something that you don't want to get yourself involved in. But that was definitely some suspicious activity. So it turned out we actually found bags of leaves, and there was a local grow somewhere. Well, we're assuming it was local. Somebody was growing marijuana hydroponically. Hydroponically means without soil. And that's how it's grown to increase the TH levels, is by growing it in a controlled environment like a house or a garage or a building. And they don't use soil. They just use wool cubes, water, put nutrients into it. And then they trick the plant into thinking it's spring, summer, and fall. And when the plant's about 3 feet tall, they say it's fall. And they change the lighting, and the plant will start budding. And I actually spent a whole week learning how to grow marijuana, which was quite fascinating. So what he was doing is he was taking the leaves, a lot of leaves, and using a solvent, which was the acetone, and the actual resin would leach out of the leaves. And again, this is a really time-consuming process. I mean, there's not a lot of THC in a marijuana leaf. So he would leach out the marijuana resin, or the THC resin, out of the leaves, and then extract it, and he would make this hash. Now, hash is concentrated THC. That the resin that you see there in this chunk here, these chunks, that's about as pure THC as you can get. That's actually the resin from the leaves up here. You can see that he actually was somewhat creative, and for some reason he put the little clover leaf in there. I don't know why he did that. He was dead, so we couldn't ask him. He didn't live with anybody. It was a guy living all by himself in a house. So I know we were out there for quite a while cleaning up that mess. But the one thing I remember, and this was a little strange, and maybe if you've ever heard of obsessive compulsive disorder, where people are really orderly and line things up and do things in certain rhythms, and they do it over and over, like turn off the light, shut the door. Anyways, study OCD. I think he was OCD, and that's why he was maybe doing this activity, because we found money. Like, we found thousands of dollars in his closet, and they were actually folded up. Little, 20s and 100s were folded up into little tiny squares, and they were in matchboxes. And we found some matchboxes, and we were looking, pulling them out of his closet. And when we saw it, we assumed kind of they were matches. And then we pulled them out, we realized it was money. And he was actually folding all his money. And again, he had a few $1,000s all folded up in like a matchbox, like the wooden striking matches, or not the wooden striking matches, but like a pack of matches. They used to sell them. I don't know if they do anymore, in a box. You could buy like a case of 50 matches. Anyways, I thought that was really strange. And, literally every photograph and every scene has a story behind it. And I find them fascinating. It was one thing that I really enjoyed, is it was no 2 days were alike. Everything was a new experience. And as you can see, the 420 is probably one of the most common slang terms for marijuana. There's a lot of slang terms. There's, chronic, pot, grass, ganja, 420, like I mentioned, bud, blunt, weed, mota. So as we look at this, there is some ethnic terms or demographic terms that come from certain groups, right? Where does ganja come from? Ganja man, right? Have you ever heard of ganja? Ganja is a term for marijuana, and it's actually the Jamaicans, ganja. How about moto? And I'm kind of blocked here. I can move myself around. Watch this. Mota. That's the Hispanic community, Mexican Spanish community. Then we have 420, grass, bud. blunt, and I'll talk about blunts in a couple minutes here. So as we move along, I might as well just tuck myself right up here. Okay. So marijuana, I call this the marijuana nation. The reason I call it the marijuana nation is that marijuana is not considered a bad drug anymore. As you've seen over the last few years, states have legalized it. And we'll see in a minute here that the perception of it is not like it used to be, being a bad drug. Marijuana is really easy to obtain. It's fairly inexpensive. It's easy to use and conceal the use. It does have some odor associated with it where most drugs don't, but it's still really easy to use, and it's relatively easy to conceal its use. And then the medicinal and recreational laws make the use of it less threatening. And on the bottom there, I have the bumper sticker, and that's a real bumper sticker. I have that. I don't have it on my car, but marijuana, hey, at least it's not crack, right? As you're going to see, I obviously working in the drug world for so many years. I'm biased and have seen the destruction, and so I'm definitely not one for legalizing any drug. When I wrote the book on street drug investigation, we actually discussed legalization of drugs. We talk about legalization of marijuana. Nobody talks about legalizing the other drugs, for the most part, marijuana. And people would say, well, crime would be reduced and the cost would be reduced if we just legalized marijuana. So let me just clue you in on some history. I'm sure nobody remembers Prohibition because that was way back in the 30s. But let's say like Prohibition was where alcohol was banned. Alcohol had been around for centuries, right? Every culture uses alcohol to some extent. It's been around forever. And the U.S. said, you know what, alcohol is causing all these problems. Let's just get rid of it. Let's ban alcohol. So they said, no more alcohol. Well, that's something where it was part of the culture. And even though it was destructive, and we know it's destructive, right? I mentioned that if you take all the deaths and the injuries and the costs of alcohol, if you take all those costs and you take all the same destruction and the costs of illegal drugs and put all the illegal street drugs together, still doesn't even get close to the destruction and the damage and the deaths caused by drinking alcohol. So alcohol, we know, obviously negatively impacts our country and the world, but it's accepted. And although I don't drink, it's accepted, and you know, I do have a problem with it, but something I can't do anything about, right? I'm pretty extreme when it comes to substances in the body. So when Prohibition came into effect, there was still alcohol, right? There were speakeasies, if you've ever heard of speakeasies. They were like underground clubs where you could go drink alcohol. You could still buy alcohol. So if it was illegal, how are people obtaining it? Well, a little history here. The mob grew. The mob was formed in the U.S. and was a result of Prohibition. The mob basically grew out of Prohibition. And they created like fast cars to outrun the cops. Did you know that NASCAR actually is a result of bootleggers running alcohol back during Prohibition? They were souping up sports cars or cars to outrun the cops and to get alcohol across the country or to wherever it needed to go. And NASCAR is a result of Prohibition. And just some interesting facts. So you look at NASCAR today, and you look at, I don't know, the drinking in NASCAR, and it's kind of goes hand in hand, right? So the mob was formed out of Prohibition, or the banning of alcohol, way back during the early days. So when we legalized alcohol again, when we said, as a country, prohibition didn't work, let's just legalize it again. We tried it, it failed. What happened to the mob? Did the mob just say, oh, like there's no more alcohol, we're out of business, might as well go get a job working on the docks, or I might want to become an accountant or a lawyer or whatever it might be. Did the mob go get another job? Well, they didn't get another job, but they found another criminal industry to get involved in. Prostitution, loan sharking, gambling, and then guess what drug they started selling? Heroin. So prohibition didn't get rid of the mob and crime. The criminals are always thinking, right? And so they're going to just move on to something else. So going back to, let's legalize marijuana. We'll get rid of all the drug cartels. We'll get rid of crime. We'll get rid of gangs. Is that going to happen? No. As a matter of fact, drug cartels, in case you didn't know, drug cartels also smuggle human bodies up from all over the world. So they're involved in drug trafficking and they're involved in human smuggling. So if drugs were legal, all of a sudden one day they were legal, they would find another industry. They actually make more money smuggling people than they do smuggling drugs, depending. So there's also growing support for marijuana legalization, and that's why we have states that have enacted their own state-level laws to make marijuana recreational use legal. And they have thresholds of like so many grams that you can possess, maybe so many ounces. And when they created those laws, they actually didn't think ahead very far, because they said, okay, for example, you can possess up to 4 grams of marijuana, and that's considered personal use. Well, they didn't say 4 grams of leafy marijuana. They just said 4 grams. I showed you, I showed you the hash substance, hash oil, and we know it's concentrated, right? So think about 2 grams of a concentrated chunk of hash, or even more concentrated. Think about hash oil. They're both depending on the concentration level of where they originated from, but think about it. 2 grams of hash and 2 grams of marijuana are vastly different. And so that's what happened. As a matter of fact, remember when I told you drug labs were declining and I got out of the drug lab business when they were pretty much almost flatlined? My old unit, which is still in operation today, isn't investigating meth labs anymore. They're investigating the cannabis oil labs, or the hash oil labs, where basically people are taking marijuana and they're extracting either the hash or the oil. And in most cases, it's the oil they're extracting, because if you can have oil and you can have, so they take the oil, which is really concentrated, and of course you can vape it, right? You can smoke it in a vapor, or you can put oil on a marijuana cigarette. You can put it on a regular cigarette, but you can possess a lot more of a heavy hitter substance than just the marijuana itself. So there's these groups, criminal groups, that are extracting oil to sell the oil. There's also people that are doing it on their own, and you can go on YouTube. I was just on there earlier looking up hash oil, cannabis oil, hemp oil, and there's pages and pages on how to extract cannabis oil or marijuana oil or hash oil from plants or from buds and leaves and all that. So the instructions are there. I'm not going to put any links, because all you got to do is find it yourself. And obviously I'm not going to provide this as an educational forum to go out and extract hash oil and marijuana oil. But they're also using solvents, right? Like I mentioned, acetone. They're using solvents that are extremely flammable. So when I would go out on meth lab fires, meth lab explosions, that's happening now with these labs that are extracting oil out of the marijuana leaves. There's still explosions happening. And those are just kind of the occupational hazards of working in a criminal enterprise where you're dealing with drugs. So let's look at this real quick here, this marijuana nation, right? So we have a growing support for marijuana legalization. So here's generational. Here's the silent, they call it the silent generation, right? That's those born between 1928 and 45. Those are our grandparents. For most of us, that's our grandparents. And this is some of these studies, there's nothing current. They do studies when they do studies. So if some of my dates show old, that's because they haven't done an updated study, or that's the best I could find. So this one here, this is when marijuana legalization was an issue around 2014. And so they're like, well, what's going on? Like, how could people be voting to legalize drugs in their country or in their state? Like, do they not know? So that's the grandparents. And then we have the boomer generation, which is going to be the largest demographic segment in our society. All of the boomers, they call them baby boomers, right? And they're born between 1946 and 1964. That generation is humongous. And my wife and I are actually involved in like training seniors in that population. Then we have Gen Xers. That would be me. I'm a Gen Xer, born between 65 and 1980. But you can see here the new generations. Remember I talked about the cartels, right? Drug cartels, and why are they warring between each other and internally, where they were not doing that decades ago. For hundreds of years, they've been cooperating. It's because every generation has different values, different morals, and this is demonstrated here. And you can see the grandparents' morals and values on drug legalization, the baby boomers right here, the Gen Xers, and what it is they're showing the percentage saying that marijuana should be made legal. See, this is a higher percentage. So look at this. The millennials born between 1981 and 1996, 69% of millennials say, yeah, let's just legalize it. So where did they get that in their mind? Did they get it from school? Did they get it from friends? Did they get it from the media? Who knows? Those are all things that are way beyond the scope of this class here. But it makes you kind of think, like, what happened from the silent generation to the millennials? But why is there such a gap here where 30%, like literally that's a 70-30, right? The Pareto principle, I talk about the 80-20 rule. There's 70% of millennials that say, let's legalize it. And the 30% of the silent majority that say, no, we shouldn't legalize this stuff. So it just shows how generations are different. But it shows that there's support for legalization, and whether right or wrong, obviously I'm opposed to it because I've seen the destruction. And as we'll find out, marijuana is truly, it's not cliche, it is a gateway drug. But we're seeing that there's acceptance in society of legalizing it. So what this does, though, is our children see this, and now our children, whatever generation they're going to be called, are going to say, oh yeah, like, it's legal, or, well, actually it's legal at a state level, but it's, like I mentioned, it's violating federal law. But then the new generation could be 100% or 98% saying, yeah, let's just legalize this. So I found this really interesting. This drug right here that you're looking at, that drug right there is considered more harmful than marijuana. What drug do you think it is? Throw out some guesses. This is where it's a bummer because I can't interact with you directly. So, tobacco. Tobacco is considered, out of these substances, tobacco is considered the worst drug. Tobacco. And if any of you have gone through school and seen all the anti-nicotine, the programming and all that, obviously nicotine is bad, tobacco is bad, causes cancer. We know that. But is it worse than alcohol? Tobacco causes cancer, causes obviously a lot. I'm not for tobacco, definitely not. But I would say alcohol. Alcohol, and I'm going to throw my opinion in here. When was the last time you were in a traffic accident and you were high on nicotine? I don't think it happens. But we know DUI and accidents is a factor. But this is a study. This is a survey. This had nothing to do with me. This is a survey that they put out there, and they said tobacco, by percentage, is worse. Alcohol, sugar, and that's sugar. Sugar is considered more harmful of a substance than marijuana. Wow. Pretty crazy stuff. So here's marijuana perceived risk by past year use by 12th graders. So this was a Monitoring the Future study, and University of Michigan did the study. So what I want to show you here is that when there is a perceived risk of anything, if they say that if like Twinkies will cause cancer or Twinkies will make your teeth fall out, and they put a big old campaign out there about Twinkies are bad for you. They'll make your teeth fall out and you get cancer. If people think they're dangerous, then guess what? If a perceived risk is high, usage goes down. So this is like, this is in about 92. That was at the peak, if you want to call it, the peak of marijuana being a risk. Well, not so much. I mean, you go way back here, right, into the 70s. And what was going on during this era here? This was pretty much after Vietnam, Woodstock, the hippie generation, and the past year usage was, or during that time, was significantly high. It was majorly high, right? Woodstock and that whole hippie generation. Past year use was sky high. Why? Because the risk was super, super low. So we began a campaign of knowing that there's risks associated with it. And in about 92, we hit a peak. But then what happened after 92 and 93? Like, why is there a drastic, like a significant drop over 2 years where the perceived risk dropped? Usually go back and look at politics and see, like, what were the politics of drugs back then? What were the politics in general? And a lot of times politics drive perceived risks, and they drive the culture of society. So that's where we're at right now. I don't have an updated study to show where risk is, but I would, if I can find it, I'll post it. So here we go. 74% of current illicit drug users, 74% use marijuana. Remember I mentioned that kind of the 80-20 rule again? So we have marijuana only. Just over half of our illicit drug users just using marijuana only. Another 20% use marijuana and another drug. For example, a lot of the meth users, they'll use marijuana to kind of take the edge off of a meth high, or when they've been on meth for a while, they'll use marijuana to come down from the meth, because it's when they're crashing, it's a really bad experience. And we'll talk about that when we get into the meth portion. And then you have about 25% of illicit drug users that just use another substance purely. Inhalants, club drugs, opioid drugs, whatever it might be. They just are using that drug. All right, let's see here. Okay, and then there's about 19.7 past month marijuana users. I need to look and see just over the last year with like California enacting it to see if there's been a perception change, or not a perception change so much, but if there's more past month marijuana users. So now we have the active chemical in marijuana, or cannabis sativa L, right? Cannabis is the class of marijuana, or cannabis is actually a class. It's like a plant. It's a Cannabis is like the chemical, not the chemical, it's like the horticultural name for the plant. You have cannabinoids that are they contain the active ingredient of marijuana or cannabis. So delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, that is actually the active ingredient that gets you high. So if you look at hemp, like a hemp plant and hemp, the leaves look pretty consistent with a marijuana leaf, but they are a little bit different. The stalks are thicker, and that's why hemp has THC in it, but the levels are so low that you wouldn't smoke it or use it. But that's why hemp's been illegal, is because it does contain some level of THC. But the higher the THC level, the higher you'll get. That's the THC is the active ingredient. I remember doing a surveillance when I was working drugs, and a car came through our surveillance, and it said THC Club, and they even had like one of them had a personalized plate. They were like the street cars, and it said the THC Club, and I thought, well, that doesn't take a scientist to figure out if you're a THC Club what you're into. So I followed them for a bit, and I observed a traffic violation, got an officer to pull over the vehicle, and one thing led to another, and we located marijuana in the car. It wasn't a big deal, but if you're going to drive around and say you're part of a THC club, then you're pretty much announcing what your lifestyle is. But the THC levels nowadays versus like in the 60s and 70s are so much higher now. They're double to triple what they were back in the 60s. So even our grandparents would, let's say they used marijuana at some point, they have no idea what the potency is of the marijuana that's out there nowadays. And you can reach higher levels of THC in marijuana by, again, hydroponically growing it, where you control the environment. And then you get a mother plant, they call it a mother plant, that has high THC, and you test it. And it's if you have a mother plant that's producing high THC content or output, then you take that mother plant, and that's the mother plant that you're going to then create a bunch of clones. You clip them off and plant them in wool cubes, and all those little clones are going to have the same THC level. So they obtain higher THC levels by crossbreeding and basically, or pollinating, and they get a plant that has a high THC level. And again, if you do it indoors, you can control the environment. The stuff grown in Mexico or out in fields or in a backyard, you don't have control over the environment. But those levels, they have increased them as well just by crossbreeding, and just like you have corn and vegetables that they're able to hybrid. Same thing they do with marijuana. It's a science. And I can guarantee there's horticulturists or the people that are involved in plants that do nothing but just deal with cannabis production. Now in Arizona, most of our marijuana comes from Mexico. There's actually, it's shifted a little bit now with hydroponic grows in the country. As well as Canada for a while. They produced something called BC Bud that originated from British Columbia. That's where it was grown in buildings. But just about everything I dealt with in Phoenix, Arizona, if it was marijuana, it was either somebody growing like on their own, or it was Mexican drug cartel marijuana. So these right here, these are seizures. Let me see if I can sneak back a slide here. This is generally how it comes up in bulk, right? It comes up in bales. These are 50-pound bales. There's 50 pounds, 50 pounds, 50 pounds, 50 pounds. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if you do the math on that, I think that's about $250,000 street level, because it would be about 2,500 pounds. Let's see here. 100, 200, 300. I did the math once. Anyways, that's about $250,000 street level marijuana right there. And those bundles, I don't even remember where those bundles came from. I recovered so many bales from different locations I kind of forget over the years, right? But that's how it comes up, bundled up like that. So the bundles like that, they'll put them in burlap bags and put it on immigrants that are looking to go from Mexico into the U.S. And in case you didn't know, if you put a 50-pound bale of marijuana on your back and trudge it across the border, generally that's your payment to get across the border and get into the U.S. And that's why, that's why I mentioned like illegal immigrants, smuggling, and drug smuggling definitely go hand in hand. And you can probably pull up, there's been videos out there, the ranchers in southern Arizona dealing with a lot of the smugglers that are smuggling humans and drugs across the border. They have cameras set up and all that, and they'll see a group of 12 lugging marijuana bales across the border. So we actually worked a group that was smuggling marijuana up. They were actually stealing vehicles like SUVs and pickup trucks from Phoenix. And I could spend an hour just telling you the story, but in a nutshell, this cartel had a couple guys up in Phoenix that were stealing trucks and SUVs, and it was usually SUVs. Matter of fact, I had a friend that had his stolen, probably by this group, and it ended up in Tucson. So anyways, they would steal the vehicles, SUVs, pickups, bring them to Tucson. They would stage them there. Then another part of the group would bring the trucks into Mexico. They would fill them up with drugs like this. And at night, with lights out and night vision, they'd basically caravan through the desert. It was usually the Tohoto Indian Reservation. They'd cruise across the Indian Reservation in stolen vehicles from Arizona, loaded down with drugs. And if the Border Patrol, because there are the shadow wolves that operate in the Tohoto Indian Reservation, or if they were another part of the border outside of the reservation, if Border Patrol showed up, they would all split up, right? Because you can't chase them all. And so they would split up and basically go in different directions. And if they were just across the border, they would head back to Mexico, or they would abandon their vehicles. But so that a lot of the stolen vehicle epidemic, Phoenix was known in the country as the top stolen vehicle. We were the stolen car capital of the country for a couple of years. And it was because of this right here. They were running drugs up. And that, I think, was around in the mid-2000s or early 2000s. You could look it up, but we were the car theft capital of the United States, and it was directly tied to drug trafficking. This is one of the guys I used to work with in drug enforcement. He's still on. He still has not retired. He's been working at the airport for like at least 10 years, working down at Sky Harbor Airport in uniform, and he's just waiting out his time to retire. That's where a lot of the cops go, is they go to the airport until they retire. And I guess it's an easy gig, but I'd be bored stiff, literally. But here he is. He worked narcotics for a while. Here he is in a marijuana, and this guy is 6 foot tall, this detective here. He's in a marijuana plant that is probably about 8 to 10 feet, maybe 10, even, that's probably at least 10 feet tall. And the point is that, like, when people grow outside, you have no control over the environment. So it's just going to keep growing until it's done growing. Here's BC Bud. Remember I mentioned British Columbia, Canada? BC Bud, they call it. And that's what it was known on the street, is BC Bud. This marijuana, the THC content on this is extremely high. And BC Bud is all hydroponically grown, meaning it's grown in a room somewhere or a building. And I've seen pictures of some Canadian grows. They call them grows. Some hydroponic grows, and they're enormous. For a while there, because the Canadian economy was down, and I think they bolstered it somewhat with marijuana production because it was going like crazy. And we had a lot coming into Phoenix, and it was coming generally up through Washington, and it was being run primarily by Asian criminal organizations. And that's where you had that Asian criminal drug trafficking organization influence, because there was Asians up in Canada that then had connections in Washington, Canada, and were smuggling it through. This here was interesting. This was also a part of that. This is different from the previous marijuana, but this was actually an Asian group. They were young, in their early 20s. Again, it was a drug trafficking organization based out of Canada, and these are all vacuum-packed marijuana bud that were concealed in computer towers. And so they're hidden in there, vacuum packed so the dogs wouldn't smell it if they got stopped on the freeway. But they had them hidden in computer towers. And the reason we were able to find it is we got a tip. Apparently they upset somebody. We got a tip that they were coming into Phoenix, and we were able to locate them, and we recovered a lot of BC bud. Now, just to give you an idea, a wholesale level pound of marijuana that comes from Mexico into Phoenix is about $100 or $100. $100 a pound wholesale. Obviously, you have to buy maybe 100, 200, 300, 400 pounds to get it down. No, I'm sorry, I said 100. That's $500 a pound wholesale. So $500 a pound wholesale. This right here, this BC bud, can go for $2,000 to $3,000 a pound, depending on the purity. Again, price fluctuates drastically depending on the quality of the substance. So this is really, really good stuff. This is an example you can see on the BC bud here. See these little crystals in here? That's actually THC resin. Like, that's the resin right there. That's what you want in a plant. And that's what you can actually see it just crystallized. That's just loaded with THC. And BC bud, or hydroponically grown marijuana, a lot of times more pretty. It has a better look to it. See that? How it that's the bud, right? The bud is the flowering portion of the plant. It's a bud that grows on the top of the plant. That's why they call it bud. It'll flower, but they don't want it to flower. They just want it to bud and prepare to flower. So this is Mexican marijuana that came right off of a bale. And how can you tell? Well, first of all, because I had the bale. Second of all, as you can see, this is just flat, compressed, squished, like literally a bale that comes out of Mexico. You saw pictures of the bales, right? Like, those things are compacted. Like, when you smuggle drugs across the border, you're not going to put it in a nice big fluffy container like the Tupperware that's full of BC bud. You're gonna pack that stuff as much as you can. And they pack the seeds, the stems, everything that comes with the plant is pretty much going to get, they cut the bud off, they bale it, and they ship it up. So the bud contains the highest levels of THC, like we talked about. So here's marijuana seeds, and here's some stems. In case you didn't know, sorry, the seeds are melon-shaped. The seeds and stems contain no THC. Now, it's still illegal. I have actually a little container of seeds, but it's still illegal to possess seeds because they can germinate. I'm going to pause it for a minute here. All right, I'm back. So the seeds are melon-shaped, and then often people save them later for growing. Matter of fact, I found a lot of seeds over the years where people that use marijuana think, well, you know what, maybe someday I'll start growing it, and so they'll save them. But again, they don't contain any THC. They're illegal to possess because they can germinate. It wasn't really heavily enforced, but if we found seeds, we recovered them, impounded them, and then sometimes they would, in the olden days, they would actually plant them to see if they would grow. They would see if they would not plant them, but they would put them on something, give them water, see if they'd germinate, and then they would actually charge somebody. But all right, so there are some stems, and these are things that obviously aren't smoked, and they're taken out of the marijuana. Once you purchase it and you're going to use it, you prepare it by removing things from it. All right, let's see here. So marijuana is generally packaged in baggies for sale. This is a common way they sell it. they'll have different weights: nickel bag, dime bag, quarter bag, different terminology. This is a photograph we seized from a kid who is definitely into his marijuana. He's got a picture there of his marijuana. He's like, "Hey, don't get my head in here. I don't want anybody to know who I am." Kind of forgot about the tattoo on his chest, so we knew who he was, and sure enough, he had the tattoo. And I can't prove that's marijuana, but he had marijuana with him, so this just kind of goes with his lifestyle. So we're going to go into marijuana paraphernalia next, but we're going to take a break. And there'll be a short quiz. I have the quizzes going along just so that you don't have to retain too much before you move on. But this would be a good time to take a break here. And then we're going to move on into marijuana paraphernalia. So I'll see you shortly.